subscribe button in the right hand corner of your screen there. I would be forever grateful. So let's just get started. Dust. The last storm was already on the horizon when I woke that Sunday morning. It hung in the south, a solid black wall of dust, churning and seemingly motionless. I'd had every intention of sleeping late into that morning, as had been my Sunday custom since Adele and the girls had left, but the distant rumbling and crackling of lightning drew me from the bed just after sunrise. I shuffled drowsily around the farm in the early morning, latching the doors of the barn, rounding up the two stubborn hogs and shutting the windows tight. I soon found myself rooted in place, captivated by the writhing shape forming in the sky. A trance-like state kept my eyes locked on the distance out in the storm when I saw a small light dust plume to the west, picked out in stark contrast with the black beyond abyss. The horse and rider at the base of the little dust devil approached the farm. At a sharp trot, my dust-bleary eyes registered the silhouette. Carl Jordan had owned the farm next to mine for as long as my family had been in the Dakotas. I grew up with his great, booming laughter warming our home nearly every single night. His usual broad, yellowing smile was absent beneath a recently trimmed mustache and a broad-rimmed cowboy hat. His dark suit was blotted with fine layer of grit that he brushed absently at. Eddie, his voice was tired and small as he looked down at me. No church today. I had not been in months, and he'd once admitted to envying me. I just did not see the need any longer, and I've relished the extra hours. I ignored his question. "What's troubling you, Carl? Maddie all right?" I asked. He turns toward the south, the storm, and sucked loudly on his lower lip. After a few moments of thought, he sighed deeply with a phlegmy rumble. "The Hendersons are dead. All of them." "Kept Saul," he said, not returning his gaze to mine. I drank this in for a moment, feeling the insides. My sinuses began to burn in the freezing and arid breeze. I briefly dwelled upon the image of the youngest Henderson, a tow-headed toddler with a dim-looking smile I had seen at the general store with Saul and Molly a few days prior. "How?" I asked. He grimaced slightly, still gazing south. "Saul's missing. No one's seen him since last night. Molly and the kids are dead, and Saul's gone." "It don't sound good, man." Carl slumped forward a little. Not for the first time how old he was, though. The whole hornet's nest is stirred up over in Picton. He was gonna lose the farm, they say. Fleetingly, it concerned me that I could easily see the connection between these facts. "Maddie's fine," he said after another silent moment. "Just a little ill this morning, but thanks for asking." He broke from the black clouds and fixed his eyes on me. He offered a pale imitation of his familiar warm smile. However, his eyes remained squinted tight, haunted with something that was bothering so deep beneath the surface. It looked as if he had so much more to say. At stayed crooked towards the storm until I lost sight of him. By noon I could only watch as it reached up and blotted out the sun. The dust storm enveloped us, obscuring the sky like the hands of God. I did my best to ration the allotment of bourbon I'd poured off that morning, watching the black wind scour the earth through a broken shutter slat. During the storms of the years before, pale and weak comparison to this tempest, Adele would huddle with the girls to read scripture, inevitably ending with the revelations in hushed, reverent tones. I tried not to scowl at her fear and awe before, but now I could feel a little tremor of doubt burning inside of me as I looked out at the sackcloth sky. When the sky darkened a few shades at nightfall, I prepared a small meal of bread and fried eggs, drained the rest of my bourbon. Then later on, I laid in the unmade bed with the world spinning in the sky and winds howling outside. My mind, I tried so hard not to think. The storm raged stronger than ever the next morning. The sun winking through the maelstrom, a fat circle of hazy orange like a fading coal. Late in the day, it showed no sign of abating, and I resigned to leave the house, if only to feed the animals. I tied my goggles to my head and damp bandana around my mouth, but I still gasped at the ragged burn of the dust when I stepped outside. The lining of my throat seemed to crack and bleed within moments. I could barely see the barn, but I set out instinctually towards it. A tall hillock of fine black dust was pressed to the side. It took me a few kicks to clear the door. The dust had seeped in everywhere, and the hogs and cows were covered in a layer of black grime. They stood still, their pens, eyes red and glassy, shuddering and jerking with each loud creak from the roof beams. They ignored the food. There was a twisting coil of anxiety in my chest when Carl arrived, leading the terrified horses behind him. His beard was matted with dust, and he had to sweep the lens off the goggles clean at my doorstep, but instead of entering, he only waved me out to join him. "Man, you need to come with me," he shouted over the storm's loud winds, hushing his tones to barely audible. The dust between his teeth had formed a thin black mud that flecked at the corners of his mouth. His tone, flat and even, was what terrified me the most. I did not argue. I pulled on goggles and offered him a second bandana. I followed close behind him, one hand on the horse's haunch. Carl picked his way down the path, navigating by some uncanny memory of the curves in the little road. We walked cautiously and deliberately west for the better part of half a mile, past Carl's own farm towards the leaning shape of the Collins farm. A throbbing dread began to stir in my breast as we approached. The air felt thick and my heart was thumping heavily against my chest. The door was thrown wide open and off one of its hinges, swinging violently in the wind. I could see Roger Collins slumped in the doorframe, the congealing blood on his forehead caked with fine dirt. His eyes, open or icy blue. Left eye beneath was a bullet hole, flooded red and tilted wildly skyward. Clutched in his curled hands was a rifle with one spent casing. Abigail Collins and her our youngest were inside, curled tightly around each other in the corner of the room. The flowers of blood that bloomed on the fabric of their dresses was bright and vivid. Slumped upright at the dinner table as if ready for a meal was another figure. This figure was filthy and caked with black dust. He seemed composed, sitting upright and proud, despite the pinprick bullet hole, clean and bloodless, standing starkly in the center of his throat. His grimy skin was dried and shriveled, eyes closed tight. The lips were sunken over the pits. It took a long, yawning moment to recognize the desiccated face. Saul Henderson's hands clasped around a revolver, looking for all the world like he'd been dead for a week. Saul Henderson grinning obscenely wide, showing dried black gums. Despite the roaring storm, there was an unearthly stillness in this house. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears as the blood rushed heavily through my body. I just slowly turned to Carl, gave him a pitiful expression. I don't know, some kind of plea for understanding or revelation of what the hell was going on. I was bringing them some canned food. Roger was worried about being able to last out a long storm. He shouted from the front porch where he was closing Roger's eyes and wiping the blood from his hand. He looked at me and stood. Jed's missing. I gazed around the room again before turning to Carl. You don't think that Jed? I began, letting the idea remain unsaid. Jed was a quiet, sickly kid, but something about him had always set my teeth on edge. No, he barked. I don't think a 15-year-old could be capable of all this. I didn't think Saul was either. None of this makes any sense. He brushed the lenses of his goggles clear once again. No, it does not make sense, I agreed. We should head into Picton and tell somebody, but I need you to drive the Collins forward. I can make it between our 3 farms on foot reliably enough, but I do not think me or that horse could make it all the way into town. Carl looked mildly embarrassed, hidden as he was behind dust and beard. I followed him to the barn. The Model A made a few grinding gasps, rasps, and croaking sounds before dying completely, refusing to respond to anything when I opened the gas cap. A damp and clumping mixture of dust and gasoline tumbled from the little opening. My breath came in increasingly shallow gasps as we moved into the Collins tractor, unscrewing the cap. The same reeking clay was stuffed to the top of the tank. The walk back towards our farms was completely, eerily silent. All I could hear again was my heart pounding. I struggled to keep my breath steady. I struggled to breathe as the inside of my sinuses were scoured and rubbed raw. First Carl's tractor, then we decided to check mine. Both were useless, clogged to the brim with dust. If Carl was as panicked as I was, he refused to show it. Eddie, I don't know what this means, he yelled to me as we crouched over my tractor, the sky even dimming darker. But I think I would appreciate if you stayed with me and Maddie tonight. The storm has to let up in the morning, I'm sure of it. I could see it, the spark of fear in his eyes, and it brought me to a place where I found a little solace. Carl stepped pace by pace ahead of me. Panicky with thoughts of Maddie sick in bed on her own, I agreed to follow. Shortly, I entered my house to gather my shotgun and a tin of coffee. I don't believe I intended to start drinking, but the bloody and crooked eye was shining wetly in my memory, and I drew from the bourbon as few soothing pulls. I recall being tired and weary from the day's grim business. I don't remember lying down on the cool wood of the floor. When I woke up gripping the gun and empty bottle, the sky was lighter, but the whirling black cloud still surrounded the world on all sides of us. The day was Tuesday. I thought through a fog of pain, or is it Wednesday? I groggily allowed the shame to flood in when I realized I had left Carl and Maddie waiting all night. After finding all the water drained the night before, I dressed for the storm and headed out to the well. The pump handle strained against me as I pressed downward, bringing up the first sounds of water. However, what came out of the pump was black, vicious, a thin black paste. I dropped the tin bucket in disgust, feeling yesterday's dread igniting behind the alcohol ache, and turned quickly towards Carl's farm. On the road, with my destination not yet visible, I turned to see behind me. There wasn't even the faint outline of my barn. In that moment, I was utterly alone, surrounded by a wall of vibrating earth and wind on all sides. It could have been all of creation, and I would never know. It could be the end of creation, and I would never know at that. I turned back towards Carl's farm and began to run in a panic, frantically hoping I had not altered direction, like being underwater and panicking and drowning because you're going down instead of up. That is how it felt. As the small, unpainted house came into view, I saw Carl's horse lying motionless on the ground, still tied to the railing on the porch. A small dune of black dust had formed against one side. The door was wide open, slamming into the wall with a sharp crack at each breath from the storm. My panic spiked like a fever when I stepped inside, and my body began to shake violently. Maddie laid spilled from her head, trailed sheets, and a shredded fragment of her nightgown. Her head was twisted, the neck bruised and bent, and bulging glassy eyes seemed to stare directly at me. Her tongue was thick and black between her teeth. Seated on the bed above her, spindly legs dangled over the edge, was the dried and leathery corpse of Jed Collins, the missing boy. His eye sockets gaped empty and black as he silently grinned at the world. Carl was nowhere to be found. I backed out quietly from the house, at last truly tuning out the chaotic roar of the storm. My mind spun, trying to make sense of utter madness, and it stoked the fires inside me. Panting, desperate dread flooded my limbs until I found myself propelled, blind, running through the storm towards my home. I continued past the hulking silhouette of my barn, legs flooding with fire as I sucked in great, long lungfuls of choking dust. I thought nothing of the destination. I only wanted to get as far away from the storm as I possibly could, as far from the empty carnal houses of my neighbors and from empty eyes and wicked grins. I made it as far as Thin Fork at the Missouri that carves the far edge of my land. I saw through the wall of the shifting gaze the black outline of the river from a distance when I approached, like showing signs of fatigue slowed in my lungs, burning like razor blades had been scraping the insides. There I saw the river more clearly, wide and unearthly still, the water black and thick, like molasses. In mute disbelief, I watched it flow, slow, the thickness and the blackness of tar, under a dark and churning sky, and then I began to understand. I nailed the shutters closed, driven by an animal urgency of purpose. The door I braced with Adele's heirloom cabinet, allowing it to crack and splinter on its side as it stacked a steamer chest on top. I didn't really believe that this world would slow whatever would come tonight in the howling darkness, but I wanted to have the time to know, to be sure. The last bourbon bottle lay empty on the floor, and I was glad for the chance to be clear-headed at last. I sat back to the wall, facing the door with the shotgun in my hands as I waited. The sky darkened and the storm continued to howl. I measured my breaths, trying to hold on. That moment of calm in between each inhale and exhale, to stretch it out until it dried and snapped apart. Late at night, when it arrived, I could hear the heavy footsteps circling the porch, pulling lightly, testing each shutter. My hands were suddenly slick with sweat and the barrel of the shotgun. The shuffling footsteps stopped in front of the door. I saw the wood flex ever so slightly as pressure was applied. A scraping sound began to rise, hissing from the small barricade as it began to slide slowly across the floor. The force on the other side of the door increased, slowing steadily, grinding against the heavy barricade until the door was open to the storm and to the night beyond. The figure swept into the room with a silent grace. It had, to be honest, surprised me, and stood regarding me. Carl's skin seemed to crackle and go taut like paper as he moved, and in the hollow of his empty eyes were tiny, twisting clouds of dust, blue ribbons of electricity arcing across the sockets. He was wickedly smiling, a smile I had never seen from him, obscene, wide grin. I felt a strange sort of calm all of a sudden, the surety of knowing despite the impossible madness of it all. I raised the shotgun. Eddie, the thing inside, Carl hissed, in a voice like grinding sand. The corpse took another step towards me, and I saw a black trickle of mud from the edge of its cracked lips. Go ahead and shoot, Eddie. See what it gets you. I smiled back at him, seeing the solution so clearly at last. I took a moment to be thankful that Adele and the girls were gone, thankful in an awful way that I'd stuck her hard enough for her to finally leave me. This would not be the night that they die. It had moved halfway across the room now, shuffling towards me, the malevolent sparks of his eyes locked on mine. The now familiar dread reared up to swallow my temporary peace. I saw in the black whirlpool of its eyes the great storm, covering the entire earth in a final gloom. I saw trails and chains of endless murder and atrocity crisscrossing the darkening world. Into the last eternal night I saw the end. The end. All I had left was a little sliver of hope, enough to spur me onward. I swung the shotgun over my chin, feeling the cool of the barrel as it pressed against my neck and my bone. The thing inside Carl jerked to a halt and ceased cloud, a flurry of dust, coursing with lightning and pure elemental hatred that I saw then surging towards me faster than I would have believed possible. The tendrils were thin and coiled and tightened and wound their way through the air, twisting towards my mouth and nose. I could feel them caress the raw passages of my lungs, hot, twisting, and unmistakably horribly alive as they slid into me. I pulled the trigger. By Joseph K. Joseph K. Dust. 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 Or by the name Cameron Zooey. By you, Mariner Oran. I think my new girlfriend might be trying to kill me. Alright, where to begin? This is weird, but I had a friend in college named Russell. This guy thought he was a god's gift to women. He was always striving to be the center of attention. He loved the spotlight more than anything. Until one spring afternoon, a quiet professor named Dr. Wang brought his world crashing down. Dr. Wang pointed out in front of the entire lecture hall that the Japanese tattoo that he thought was cool was actually Chinese, and it was utterly ridiculous. No, it means freedom, he laughed nervously as everybody stared right at him. I assure you that tattoo is in Hanzi, and it says, Mein Fei, free to charge. I remembered the whole room erupted in laughter at my cocky friend while he stood there speechless. You know, though, what the absolute part of everything was, Russell acted like he didn't even give a shit. He kept the mistranslated tattoo and never once acted ashamed of it. He owned that monstrosity. I thought about the college story that morning as I pulled away the white bandage from my sore upper cheek. Underneath some saran wrap goop, I found myself staring at a tiny tattoo. A permanent tattoo on my fucking face. This is 2 weeks ago, and this whole insane ordeal started the night before I got uncharacteristically drunk with my ex-girlfriend and woke up alone at my place with this thing on my face. This tattoo took a good half an hour before I could stop hyperventilating at the sight of it and calm down to take a realistic assessment of what was actually stamped permanently onto me. Honestly, the tattoo in itself was quite small. A small tat in black ink in the shape of a small eye. I honestly had no clue how I got the idea to get that stamped onto my face, into my skin. The simple eye was about the size of a tear and about half an inch below my actual lower left eye. Below that was, I don't know, some kind of Lego shape, and to the right, that Lego shape was a similar but more detailed shape that looked like a small person kneeling. Altogether, the thing is maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter. No, I called my ex, who was anything but a morning person. She swore up and down that it was all my idea. I was drunk. searching on my phone for the perfect tat. Apparently, that is the masochistic thing that I settled on. I'll be fine. This is 2023. My manager at my work has arm-sleeved tattoos, and it has done nothing to hurt his career. This isn't the 1900s, dude, she told me. I ended up calling in sick to work that day. I just couldn't stomach the thought of everyone in the company staring at the new guy with the awful tattoo. I wondered whether they would think I was in some kind of strange gang or something. I just didn't think I could face anyone. The following morning, though I got up, got dressed, and headed off to work to face the music, I ventured into my boss's office to break the news and brace for the inevitable backlash. Nice. I don't think I've seen anything like that. Oh, before I forget, do you want to sign this birthday card for Vanessa? He said somewhat distractedly. Maybe it wouldn't be bad. I thought after that, my boss, the only one whose opinion really counted, did not seem to care. Nobody else really looked as I walked to my desk. Admittedly, though, I spent most of the time strategically covering it with my hand. Once I sat down, I relaxed just a bit and started my work. Mid-morning, still an hour or so until lunch, when I noticed Lindsay staring. She swiveled around in her chair so that she was facing directly into my cubicle. Her mouth was slightly opened and her face was frozen and expressionless. Her eyes, though, burned daggers right into mine. Awkwardly, I smiled. My adrenaline jumped. I said, "Hey, what's up?" to her and waited for her to ask about my tattoo. But she did not move. In fact, she didn't move for the next 5 freaking minutes as I waited for her to say something, to speak, to talk. Okay, I didn't know what to think. This was the most uncomfortable I'd ever felt in my life. I assumed she was gonna do something any second, but no, she just stared motionlessly at my face like she was trying to win some unagreed upon staring contest. I did what any rational, mature adult does in a weird situation. I awkwardly shifted back to my computer and pretended to work, ignoring my rude cubicle neighbor. Without even looking, I could feel her gaze firing on me for a while, itching my face as I wondered how long she could keep this pointless charade up. After a while, I actually settled into getting some real work done. An hour later, when I was getting ready to go to lunch, I stood up and fully intended to walk out of my cubicle, head straight to my car. I would not give this weirdo the satisfaction of glancing in her direction. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't help myself. I peeked quickly at her and yelled in surprise. Lindsay was still staring right fucking at me as drool was running down her chin. It's like she hadn't moved the entire time. I walked over to her in order to ask her what was going on, and her head followed my path. Well, at least she wasn't dead. "Lindsay, are you okay?" Why are you staring at me?" She didn't move. She stared right at the tattoo on my face. "Heading to lunch. Where are you treating me?" Caleb from Contracts asked as he walked down the row of cubicles that I found myself standing in. "Dude, what is going on with Lindsay? Did you see her?" "She will not stop staring at me," I asked him in exasperation. "What's going on?" he asked. I pointed and looked back to her frozen form. She made no attempt to move whatsoever. When I looked back to Caleb, he was facing me directly. He was staring straight at me with that same blank, soulless expression. "Fuck," I mumbled and sprinted off towards the bathroom. I checked out my reflection in the mirror, and the only thing I could see was the area on my cheek where the tattoo was a little clearer and not as red. No sign of infection. Well, it didn't look that bad. Turning away from my reflection, I left the office, did not come back to work for the rest of the afternoon. The next day I decided working from home was much better. I made an emergency appointment for a tattoo laser removal, but they were pretty booked. The next time they could see me was in a few weeks. I'd have to deal with it for the time being. Plus, I was warned it usually takes several sessions to significantly dissolve the ink. Maybe I was overthinking everything, but I could swear I feel everyone at the office talking about me, staring, hypnotized by my tattoo. But at this point, my tattoo was healed. The tattoo that scribbled on looked like someone ran up to me on the street and drew this right on my face with a ballpoint pen. I guess if I was a rapper, it might be kind of cool, or maybe if I was a prisoner. Instead, I was some guy that spent most of his time trying to avoid attention. The next morning, I pretty much accepted my ordeal with this whole thing. I thought, if I'm stuck with this tattoo, I might as well dress a bit cooler. So instead of the slightly overdressed business casual that I normally wore, I put on some trendy cargo pants and a loud pink fleece jacket that screamed, "Look at me, here I come." If people were going to be looking, I'd figure I would go all out. No room for embarrassment if I was rocking my edgy look. At work that day, 5 people were waiting in the lobby. I never really noticed before how harsh the lighting was in the building, but here in that unwelcoming lobby with 5 other employees staring at me, hypnotized, mouths opened, I realized how deathly white and blaring the lights shined. "What's up, losers?" I said casually to the unresponsive gawkers. I thought maybe I could actually live with this for the next month or so if I needed. "Wow, you're looking sharp." That voice, the voice of an angel named of Dina, caught me off guard. Dina is someone that is, without any doubt, 100% way out of my league. She surprised me as she walked in just after I did. "Oh, thanks, you do," I told her, completely devoid of any riz whatsoever. I couldn't believe it, though. Dina and I started talking later that day. I even built up enough courage to ask her out to dinner. I was surprised when she said yes, but even more surprised that she insisted we go out that very evening. Don't ask me how I did it, but we ended up back at her place. "Do you mind if I give you a massage?" she told me unexpectedly. "Are you kidding?" "Not at all," I told her. I was on the bed without my shirt. She wasn't done surprising me, though. She pulled out some overpoweringly fragrant essential oils or something and started rubbing this all over my back. Way too strong of a smell, but I went along with it. I won't go into any graphic details, but we slept together that night. I couldn't believe my luck. What started off as the worst week ever was turning into the best. That evening I had dreamt that night was somewhat disturbing. I dreamt that I was somewhere dark, completely pitch black, like I was in some kind of void. I could not move at all. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. This felt like it lasted for hours until I could see a faint light in the distance. It looked like some kind of ship that was sailing away. I woke up immediately. I could tell something was wrong. Dina was sort of kneeling over me and holding something to my nose. I could feel it pushing deep into my nostril as she whispered, "Ni win wen di winky whisper." She was stabbing something into my nostril. I pushed her off and immediately scrambled up and bolted for the door. I looked back and saw her standing there completely calm. "Anukba emme, sir," she said. She was holding a chopstick in her hand. Worse, she looked horrifyingly calm for someone that just had tried to stab that thing up my nose. "Dina, what the hell?" I screamed at her. I was halfway out the bedroom door, but stood there waiting. I was absolutely terrified of her. Her face then shifted completely from one of calm to intensely worried. She dropped the chopstick and then started to breathe rapidly. "What? Was I sleeping? Shit, I'm sorry. I haven't had a sleepwalking incident in so long. I'm so sorry," she said before she broke out into a fit of sob. She looked so sad and vulnerable. I couldn't just leave her there. I realized when I looked at her that I was already hopelessly in love with her. Her reaction seemed genuine, but I didn't know. I couldn't just leave her there, so I played it off and said nothing. Eventually, when we got back into bed, and she cried on my shoulder. She then fell asleep while I stared at the ceiling the whole night. Obviously, I couldn't do anything close to falling asleep after what had happened. It felt good, though, just to be there with her, Dina, the woman of my dreams. That's the story. It's only been a week, but she hasn't had another incident since then. I think that might be a good sign, right? Am I being crazy? What do you think? Do you think she might be trying to kill me, or is this all some big misunderstanding? By you/Marriott9. My husband is stalking me and the police will not help. Sorry if I'm a little rambly. I don't know where to begin. Hope I can get some advice here because I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have any siblings. My parents are out of town and the cops aren't helping. Any advice would be appreciated. So I guess I will start with the cops. Darren is one of them. He was my husband. Well, to be all honest, he still is technically. I met him about 8 years ago at a park. He was tall, had a gentle voice, and well, short story shorter, we were married 6 months later. Everyone told me it was a terrible idea, but at the time it made complete sense and my love struck ahead. We were in love and the things would work themselves out like everybody thinks at first. And to be honest, for a while they did. Things were great. He graduated from the police academy, paid my way through veterinary school, and he did his part to keep our relationship rock solid. We had our ups and downs, of course, but we were a happy family of 3, me, Amanda, Darren, and our dog, Theo. A few years ago, though, he stumbled through the door from a late-night shift and collapsed into a kitchen chair, head buried in his arms. I was awake, of course. He hated that I stayed awake for him when I had to work in the morning, but I could never sleep soundly knowing there was a chance he would not come back that night. I walked to his side, placed a hand on his shoulder, and asked cautiously, "Babe, are you okay?" He sighed, and after a moment raised his head. I saw that his face was pale, his hands trembling, drumming erratic patterns into our kitchen table. "Yeah," he muttered. "Yeah, damn it, it's nothing." He sat there for a while, staring into space and drumming his fingers oddly into the counter, then fetched a beer from the fridge and mechanically made his way to our couch. My prodding did not elicit any answers from him or even much in the way of a response, so I finally, with no better option, I went to bed alone. Then next morning, as I rushed out the door to work, he was still sitting at the couch, staring with a dead expression at an old football rerun. Answers to what had happened the night came slowly and never from him. I gathered what details I could from his co-workers and later from his emails, as I probably breached privacy to read a cop's professional correspondence and a little illegal, but I was desperate. This was my husband. I had to know what was wrong with this man. There was little good into what happened anyways. He had been out an indefinite paid leave following a quote-unquote incident. The answer finally came in a newspaper article a few days later. The article depicted a grisly man named Morgan covered with scars, with a fierce expression on his face. He was one of the most wanted people in America and had finally been put away recently after a short firefight. The guy was apparently responsible for quite a few murders, and reading between the lines, the murders were merciful compared to what he inflicted on people for weeks beforehand. My heart went out to my husband. I knew he did his best to keep me in the dark about what he dealt with on a day-to-day basis, feeling like I shouldn't be burdened with it. He shouldn't have had to deal with these things on his own. For the next few months, all I could do was take care of him. We went on dates together, stayed in to watch movies, ate lots of good food. I took plenty of time off work and tried my best to help. Over time, I learned a little more about that night. He had arrested Morgan, of course, but that was not what troubled him. What kept him awake at night was the subsequent investigation into the man's house. The grisly remnants of those past victims, and all above the ghoulish cries of still living captives begging for death. I did what I could to help ease his mind. Thing is, he never got better. The trash on the floor began to overflow with a growing assortment of beer bottles. His mood turned wicked. He snapped at me at random, a dark expression on his face. After a few months, I started spending more time at the clinic to stay out of his way. He lost contact with what few friends he had and gained new ones. Parasocial relationships with celebrities and influencers who supplied him with an endless stream of political, hate-filled programming. Our relationship had been, well, never perfect, but it had been good. I had never expected him to be capable of changing so much so quickly. When I did reach out to friends, they seemed incapable of helping. Occasionally one would give him a call, he'd grunt a few, I don't know, 1 or 2 word responses to their questions, and then would slam his phone, hanging up quickly on them, returned to wallowing in his misery. Eventually his paid leave ran out, but he did not go back to work. He refused any therapy or medication, stating that he was perfectly mentally healthy. There are some things he would say that I shouldn't move past. Somebody needs to remember what happened to those people and what the world is really like. A miserable time, but I could have dealt with it, and did for months. But what really tipped me over the edge was the gaslighting. It started small, as these things tend to do. I noticed our shared computer never seemed to have any browsing history, and there were little charges to our bank account that I could not identify exactly with generic names like bread and withdrawal. That would not have upset me either much. I did not exactly have high expectations for him at this point, but he denied all of it when I brought it up. One day I confronted him about it. He denied spending any of our money as usual, and I tried to drag him up the stairs to force him to confront our online credit card statement. He absolutely refused. I rushed upstairs alone to take a picture of it, and by the time I had reopened the web page, there was a new charge. My jaw dropped when I saw it. He had to be doing it intentionally to get a rise out of me. Well, I won't let him. I was already practically his maid. I wouldn't offer him my sanity due. I walked back downstairs. After composing myself, he was back to playing his video games, acting like nothing had happened. I followed his lead and said nothing of the matter. From there, things escalated. The charges got bigger, at least until I started putting most of my money into a personal account. My toothbrush would go missing regularly. That was one of his favorites. Theo's food would vanish from the garage. I'd have to hunt around our backyard to find it. Every time it would be in a different place, and each time a little bit farther. I hoped at least one of us was enjoying these games. Occasionally I would ask him about these things. Babe, have you seen my toothbrush? I'd smile innocently as if we didn't both know what was going on. He would feign stupid ignorance as always. Occasionally he'd even have the gall to get mad at me for continuing to lose these things. I would never pegged him as a good actor, but well, he'd changed quite a lot since his incident in other ways too. I never once caught him hiding things, but that was no surprise. He usually stayed up, face bathed in the blue light until the early morning hours, then slept in until 1 or 2 in the afternoon. I wasn't crazy enough to wreck my whole sleep schedule just to catch him in the act. Well, okay, so maybe I was. I stormed through the front door one day, frazzled after a long surgery. My husband met me at the door. Hey, did you say you picked up dog food yesterday? I can't find it anywhere, he said. Yeah, I did. It should be in the garage, I told him, brushing past him on my way into the house. Well, it's not there, he said. He put his hands in his pockets, looking a bit concerned. You seem to be forgetting a lot. Are you feeling okay? I couldn't deal with this right now. I turned around, passing him again to get back into the car. Sure, I guess. I forgot again. I snapped some venom in my words. I'll go get some more. My mistake. That night, I told him I'd need to stay up late to finish some taxes. I stayed at the computer in our study until he pretended to go to bed. Then found a recording of a keyboard clacking, put it on repeat, and locked the study door from outside. Blue light filtered under the door frame, and keyboard clicking sounds emanated from within. That done, I stepped quietly downstairs and into our garage, leaving the lights up. He always liked to play games with me after our arguments, making me doubt my sanity, and now I waited for him to try again. My hand rested on the light switch, ready to expose him in this next attempt to disappear. The dog food. The hours dragged on, and even my burning rage was no match for the exhaustion I felt sitting still in the pitch darkness. I woke to a shuffling sound and flipped the switch. In a rush, the light blinded me, but I heard a clatter of footsteps retreating into our house. I rushed after them, still sleep-addled and disoriented, and stumbled up the stairs, but besides some banging sounds from our water heater in the attic, I heard nothing. Darren, I hissed angrily, and stormed into our bedroom, already knowing what I would find there. What's going on, honey? Darren asked, the picture of innocence. His face was laden with sleep, and his groggy blinking artfully realistic. My blood boiled that he'd have the gall to maintain that act even now. You know what? I shouted, tears coming to my eyes. Don't deny it. Don't be like this now. He sat up quickly, a perfect expression of hurt and confusion in his eyes. To this day, I don't know how or why he kept the act up. I didn't calm down. My anger turned colder. You need to get out, I told him, my voice trembling. I can't keep doing this. I don't know who you are anymore. Amanda, he began, but I wasn't having it. Things had gone far too long. He had his Cheeto-riddled shirt and his well-worn gaming console moved out that night. All went well for a few weeks. He moved in with his aging parents a couple states over and even picked up a minimum wage job. Oh, so I heard from his voicemails anyway. As if I could just trust anything he said at this point. Just as I was beginning to get my feet back on the ground and starting over, things started to go missing again, same as the last time. At first I thought I was going crazy. It was little things, leftovers in the fridge, or Theo whining at me for food when I thought for sure I'd just filled his bowl. But I'd seen this before I knew what was happening. Somehow he was sneaking into the house to continue gaslighting me. I still had a job to maintain, leaving him ample time to pick the new locks and sneak in while I was gone. It crushed me that even moving out had not been enough of a wake-up call for my husband. But I had to worry about myself at that point. I don't feel safe in my own house anymore. I filed a police report, but when they called back a few days later, they were less than helpful. Ma'am, Darren's friend Henry said in an overly professional tone. His parents reported he's been with them the entire time. He even has a receipt at a local restaurant he visited the night you claimed he was in your house. They covered for him, of course. Things got worse. My car's gas was siphoned. My internet went out. I started hearing breathing in our home phone line. And Darren caused 100 other inconveniences to make my life hell. Yesterday, Theo went missing. God, I hope he's alright, but I doubt it. A few hours ago, Darren left me another voicemail trying to scare me. I don't know why I even listened to them at this point. Some wild tale about that murderer he put behind bars having escaped months ago. Then he said he was driving over immediately. He's supposedly a day away, but I heard footsteps downstairs. I've locked myself in the study while I write this post. So that's the context. If you're still with me, I'd love some advice on how to tell him that I seriously do not want him to stay away. He needs to get used to the idea of life without me. By you, Seder Dad. I've always associated my birthday with the depressing time of year where a cozy autumn turns into an early winter decay. The 72-hour sleep ban, where colorful leaves die, leaving a withered brown shell behind. Still, people are expected to celebrate their birthdays. Strange if one doesn't. I don't. My fiance recently asked me why I never celebrate my birthday, and it's a hard one to explain. When you've been through something dramatic, everything sort of brings you back to that moment in time. While I'd love to tell her about it, I don't think I can without sounding like a lunatic. I thought I'd start by just telling my story anonymously and I guess start and go from there. I don't know how this plan will go. It was the year I turned 13. Since You've Been Gone was blasting on the radio every hour of the day. My friends and I were quoting How I Met Your Mother religiously. It was a good time to be a kid. Since my birthday was in the middle of a school week, my big birthday plans were postponed until the upcoming weekend. Still, I couldn't complain. Birthday cake on a Tuesday did not sound all that bad. I got home at a small celebration with my parents, opened a few presents, 2 new games for my PlayStation 2, score. I finished up my homework and browsed the net for a few hours ahead of my scheduled bedtime when there was a knock at the door. have someone knocking at our door at 10 p.m. was extremely unusual, to say the least. My parents had already opened the door by the time I was halfway down the stairs. A man in a fancy jacket with a clipboard standing outside, along with 2 armed guards. I sort of fell into the middle of the conversation. So we need you to sign the consent form and we'll get started. The clipboard man said. Any questions? This can't be legal, my mom said. On what kind of authority are you? Ma'am, this is an emergency. We have been authorized to bring anyone and everyone if need be, but I promise you it will be a less pleasant experience than what you could achieve here in the comfort of your own home. As the discussion continued, the armed men pushed into the house. They had sort of a checklist they were going through, asking questions as they poked and prodded through our stuff. One of them mentioned a satellite phone, which we did not have. I scurried back up the stairs. From my window, I could see them putting wheel locks on our car. They were testing some sort of electrical equipment too as they did. I could see the internet connection on my computer disappear. My cell phone lost all bars, and while I didn't check, I suspected they'd done something to our landline as well. They were isolating us, putting us under some sort of lockdown. I still did not have the slightest idea who these people were. There were no badges, ranks, or symbols, just a bunch of serious-looking men in windbreakers with visible gun holsters. After a few minutes, one of the men entered my room. My parents were worried sick, but were told to wait outside. The man towered over me, being about 6'4", and had the look of someone who could kill me with his bare teeth if need be. Without a word, he started to go through my things. You got any walkie-talkies? He asked. Any radio science projects, something like that? No, I said, shaking my head. I have a PlayStation 2. That can go online, right? I never got the chance to answer before my mom added, We don't let him play online games, she said. It can't do that. As if to make sure, he pulled the power cable and dropped it in a sealed bag along with various knickknacks and the keys they'd collected. They were not taking any chances. I was playing my new games anytime soon, it seemed. As they finished up their impromptu house inspection, we were asked to gather downstairs. The fancy man with the clipboard cleared his throat, and the room fell deathly silent, including my father, who was usually a very assertive man. He didn't have not much to add to the conversation. That's how I knew it was serious. For 72 hours, this and surrounding neighbors are under lockdown, the man explained. There is a localized problem related to a recent geological event which has caused some unexpected issues. I'm sure you've noticed some minor oddities of late. Like what? My dad added. Milk turning sour, houseplants getting a strange color tint, swarms of frogs cluttering the roads. My parents said nothing, but they nodded. Perhaps they'd seen something I had not. The man put down his clipboard as he explained calmly. You've been exposed to something akin to a chemical. It reacts violently to the release of certain hormones which are associated with deep REM sleep. To ensure your safety, we are currently enforcing a temporary 72-hour ban on sleep. Excuse me, my dad took a step forward, but one of the armed men responded. They both stopped before it had the chance to escalate. Exposure was approximately 9 hours ago, meaning you have about 63 hours left to go. That'll be approximately 1 p.m. on Friday. There is no way we can. This is not a negotiation. This is a matter of your security, sir. We have an emergency health service site, but I can promise you that it won't responsibilities and our rights, which didn't feel like many. An unmarked red folder with 3 papers, one explaining the right to force this upon us, another explaining that we'd already signed the consent papers, and a third one was a form explaining exactly when we could go to sleep. There was also an inventory form explaining the items we were to have returned at the end of the containment. They left a box of 50 glass vials, some kind of 4-hour booster shots. The man explained how underage children were not to take more than one every 7 hours, and that my mother, if pregnant, should not take any at all. Luckily, my mom was not pregnant, but I am only a child. We were also given fiber bars of some kind of hormones supplement, unmarked and unbranded, but warm. Maybe they were made recently. The packaging was sloppy at best. The fancy-dressed man was trying his best to explain. I could see my parents eager to listen. I barely understood half of it. Instead, I looked at the armed guards. I saw into them and really looked at them. They looked exhausted. Maybe they, too, were not allowed to sleep. One of them had his mouth open and almost drooled, blinking one eye at a time. I could have sworn he nodded off for a second, which prompted him to take a walk outside. Honestly, I don't know if we can do this, my mother complained. It's a lot to ask. We only just... If at any point you can't do this, you need to call this number. It's the only number that works, the man said, pointing to the final line on the final page of the folder. If someone falls asleep and can't be awoke within a few minutes, they are in terrible danger. If that happens, try to keep them awake by any means until we can get here to pick them up, and then they'll be taken to our site in Mankato, where they'll be chemically induced to stay awake. So what exactly happens if someone doesn't make it? My mom said. If we all just fall asleep. The man shook his head, tapping the clipboard with his pen. Unfortunately, ma'am, they will most probably die. Others might too. While they went into the kitchen to explain the details, the angry-looking guard approached me with the sealed bag, handing me back my PlayStation 2 power cable. He gave me a pat on the shoulder. I checked with the team, he said. You're good to go, and oh yeah, happy birthday. I'd almost forgotten that it was my birthday. I appreciated the gesture, but I just couldn't bring myself to smile. I had too many questions bubbling in the back of my mind, and I was too afraid to speak. The people probably talked to my parents for another 20 minutes or so before they left, leaving me, my parents, alone in the kitchen. My mother was smoking under the kitchen fan. I'd only seen her smoke 2 times. Once when she lost her job, and another time when her father got sick. Smoking in the kitchen was a surefire way to tell something was terribly wrong. Dad was sitting with his arms crossed, looking at the box of booster shots. This is not a joke, my father finally said. This is very serious. We are all going to need to help each other to get through this. My mother said nothing, but I could see her hands trembling. She had been crying. She was shaking so much that the ash from her cigarette didn't reach the ashtray. It just plopped down on the stove. We cannot be alone, Dad continued. We are going to do best to keep busy. You can play as many games as you want, but you cannot fall asleep. They gave back my power cable, I said. Does that mean it's okay for me to use the PlayStation? It's okay, my mom coughed. It's okay, honey, play your games. For those first few hours, I did not understand what the big deal was. No more school for the rest of the week. No bedtime. and unlimited screen time. At first, it did not sound all that bad. I gamed late into the night. Sly 2 and Ratchet and Clank were on the menu, and I had a blast. I got some snacks along with one of those fiber bars. They tasted like twigs and raisins, but it made my brain calm, not tired. But it made it easier to focus. It also made it harder to shut my eyes, making my eyelids itch. All night in the house, we kept on all throughout the night. Mom and Dad kept playing music on the downstairs stereo, and they desperately tried to keep me engaged. I was engaged enough just playing games, so I think it was more than their benefit rather than mine. At 5 a.m., Dad took his first booster shot. I could hear it all the way down from upstairs. He was cussing pretty hard. Apparently those things tasted like a mix of stale rice and death. Mom took her first booster shot about a half hour later, but she mixed it with orange juice. Apparently that helped. By 7 a.m., even I was feeling it. I'd never been up all night playing games like that on a school day before. Sure, I'd pulled all-nighters with my friends, but it was usually something we prepared for, so by early morning I could feel myself nodding off. My parents were checking in on me every now and then and decided to act. We were having family breakfast, pretending as if we'd already slept. You're always cranky in the morning, Mom said. Try to imagine. This is just that, another cranky morning. I knew for a fact that they'd slip one of the boosters into my cereal. I saw 3 empty vials on the counter, and I knew none of them had taken a second one yet. Still, I had little choice but to try. We were not even halfway through the containment yet. As we finished our breakfast, we could hear commotion outside. I was upstairs brushing my teeth, watching through the hallway window. It was our neighbor's Larry Peterson, the 55-year-old man who worked the fishing supplies at the local mini mall, crawled out his front door. He was throwing up something black and blue onto the pavement. I'd never seen this man do anything more physically straining than trying to start a lawnmower, and now he was crawling on all fours like his life depended on it. I could hear his wife calling from inside. She was screaming at him, but I could not hear what. Larry got up and almost leaped into the back of his pickup truck in a show of athleticism, and I'd never seen that from him before. It wasn't until his wife got out of the house that I could hear what she was saying. "Larry," she cried. "Larry, wake up." I saw Larry Peterson grab a wrench, get out of the truck, and grab his wife by the hair. Suddenly a hand covered my eyes as my father dragged me away from the window. I could hear a scream turn into a gargle, followed by a hearty laugh, one I'd heard 1,000 times before. This same kind of laugh Larry Peterson would chuckle up whenever my dad tried to pull off a bad pun. My mind painted me a picture of what had happened, and it wasn't pretty. My dad spun me around and stared into my eyes. I could tell he wasn't not himself. There were lines across his face that I had never seen before. "Stay with me and Mom," he said. "Do not look outside. People are getting sick." "Are we getting sick, Dad?" I asked, a yawn escaping me. He shook me a little as if to make sure I was paying attention. "We will be fine," he said. "It's just a matter of time, but I don't want you to see people getting hurt. Larry isn't feeling well." There was a knock on the front door. Dad took point as Mom hid in the bedroom. I remember standing on top of the stairs looking over the railing to the floor below. There was a violent, angry pounding on the door. Larry Peterson's soft chuckle coming from the other side. He didn't say anything. He just pounded on the door with his wrench, laughing as he tried to get into our house. He went around our house, rattling our windows. He did not get far before we could hear a car roll up. There was a popping sound, but not like a gunshot. I think they dazed him. By the time I could hear Larry Peterson get dragged off, my mom had come upstairs with a smile taped to her face, asking me to show her how far I'd gotten in my fancy new video games. She was clearly trying to keep me distracted, but I didn't mind. At that point, I wanted desperately to be distracted. All I could imagine was Larry Peterson on the other side of the front door, his white t-shirt stained with this strange black and blue goo he had thrown up, wielding that wrench with a manic grip. The thing was as large as my arm and solid metal. I would never considered it a weapon, but thinking about it made my blood run cold. Had he really killed Mrs. Peterson, and why? Mom and I spent the next few hours playing video games. We also made a plan. We went through our old DVDs and decided on a watching schedule. She originally planned a walk, but now we weren't to leave the house. She did not want to say why, but I had the feeling that there was something outside the Petersons' house that she did not want me to see. Blood stains, maybe. I was too afraid to find out. My parents tried their best to keep the mood up, but I could tell it was getting to them. My dad was mostly just standing there, leaning against the door, staring straight ahead like in a trance. Mom tried to occupy herself by playing games and watching DVDs with me, but she was counting the minutes until she could get to her next booster shot. I wasn't eager to take one. They made my stomach queasy. We made it all the way until noon. Dad was having trouble staying up and kept washing his head with cold water. He tried to keep busy doing housework that he'd kept for a rainy day, but there were constant distractions. We could hear sirens in the distance, and at one point there was someone spraying our front door and windows with a high-pressure water hose, possibly to wash away the last traces of Larry Peterson. There were dog patrols going up and down the street, along with the occasional phone call. The one number that still worked, where someone called to make sure we were all still awake and accounted for. By dinner time, Mom was having stomach troubles. Her shaking had gotten worse, and she was having trouble with sudden. By dinner time, Mom was having stomach troubles. Her shaking had gotten worse, and she was having trouble with sudden change of smells. Dad kept rubbing his eyes and checking his watch, getting up every 10 minutes or so just to move around. We had decided that we were going to play board games after dinner, but Mom was having trouble keeping herself from throwing up. We ended up just reheating a lasagna from a few days back. I didn't mind. Mom made amazing lasagna, but my appetite was quickly lost when I saw my mother barely keeping it together. She kept drooling and making this weird chugging sound. She was blinking slower and slower. Dad tried to get her to eat one of the fiber bars, but she just ran out of the kitchen, locking herself in the bathroom. It was touch and go for a while. I could feel my heart racing as Dad tried to convince her to unlock the door, but she just couldn't do it. After a while, she stopped responding. Dad had to break the handle with a hammer. But it was too late. She was already sleeping. I could hear it through the door. As the door burst open, Mom had only been asleep for a couple of seconds, a minute at most. But she was sitting on the toilet, her head leaning back, and something was coming out of her mouth. Black and blue fingertips poking out over the edge of her lips. Her throat undulated. The moment Dad grabbed her, she tipped her head forward, coughing. Dad washed her face in the sink while yelling at me to wait in the other room. I waited for a few minutes, sitting there ready to run or hide. It might have been too late. I figured the worst. She could have already been affected like Larry Peterson. I could hear them arguing in the other room as their voices went from angry to desperate to sad. I did not know what to do. When they finally returned, they sat me down to explain miles halfway through and that we were in the home stretch. They were so kind, warm, and careful in the way they explained it, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I had trouble focusing, and all I could think about was that strange noise I kept hearing in the background. Something was outside. Dad was halfway through explaining how we were not going to lock our bathroom doors anymore when something in me screamed at me to react. It was just a slight click, click, click. Clear as day. Clear as day. I closed. Maybe it was those booster shots, but I kept hyper-focusing on little details rather than the big picture. Like an actual conversation taking place in front of me, I closed my eyes and no less than a second later, there was a loud bang, bang. They were shooting. Somebody was shooting at us. It was only a couple of shots, but we dropped to the ground. One shot got lodged in the front door while the other cracked the kitchen window. There were loud voices outside laughing hysterically. They were talking but barely making any sense. One of them sounded like she was trying to talk with food in her mouth. Mom and Dad kept quiet as 2 more shots popped off. One of them hitting the kitchen light with an electric spark gave out, blackening out most of the kitchen. I could hear someone running and laughing as they continued down the street. In the distance, there was more gunfire, maybe someone responding in kind. "We can't stay here," Mom whispered. "We have to call them." "You want to go where they put Larry?" Dad answered. "To be in a whole hospital full of these people." "They're shooting at us. We can't just..." Mom quieted down and looked at me. She and Dad excused themselves to talk in private while I was asked to move upstairs. I was to stay away from the windows, and I could not sit or lie down. They'd be up to check on me in a minute. But of course, I was way too curious. While still hearing them argue downstairs, I checked an upstairs window. I could see pretty far down the street, and in the distance I could make out a car stalling on the side of the road. The headlights were still on, but it was surrounded by at least 6 people. 2 of them were dressed like the armed guards we had seen earlier. It took me a while to realize there was an old man sitting in the car. I recognized him. I'd seen him around a couple of times. I did not know his name, though. The surrounding people were trying to crack the car windows with various weapons, tire irons, bricks, hammers, lead pipes, whatever they could get their hands on. It did not take them long to break, though. They reached into the car and pulled the man out. Too far off for me to hear his screams, but I could vaguely see what they were doing. They held him down and covered his face with their hands. His eyes, his mouth, his ears, leaving only his nose to breathe through. They just sat there. It took me a moment to realize what they were doing. They were forcing him to sleep. After a few minutes, they let go of him. The old man slowly stood up, leaned against the car, and started to drive. After a while, the same blue and black goo that I had seen from Larry Peterson started pouring out of his mouth, stopping only as he coughed up some kind of clot that could barely fit in his mouth. A clot that moved. He straightened his back. He looked at the strange group, and they walked down the street together. Some jogged, some sprinted, one of them crawled. But it looked like he had held onto something with his teeth. Either that or something was coming out of his mouth, something long. As they hurried down the street, I could hear more gunfire in the distance coming from another way. I could see another group of people, at least a dozen, but heading in another direction, roaming gangs of sleep-deprived, sick people. God knows how this affected them long term. When my parents were done discussing They sat me down to explain that they were going to stay indoors and keep away from the windows just in case. We were locking all doors and windows, closing all curtains, not playing anything louder than necessary. We were to draw as little attention to us as possible. Of course, I agreed. What choice did I have? That night, I could tell things were deteriorating. Dad almost took a double dose of booster shots as he forgot he had taken the first one, but my mother stopped him. There were no phone calls coming in. They'd stopped checking in on us. My mom even tried calling, but the line had been disconnected. The gunfire outside was further away, but more frequent. We could hear cars honking, but no sirens. Then there were fires, at least two, somewhere downtown. We could see the smokestacks from afar. Mom, she was not doing well. She couldn't eat, and at times she could barely stand on her feet. She kept talking out loud, even if no one was in the room with her, and she had to lean against things to stay upright. She couldn't keep the fibroid bars down, and she walked around with her head bobbing back and forth. Dad tried his best to keep her active, but he was having trouble as well. No matter how many cold splashes he took to the face, he just couldn't stay attentive. I wasn't doing well either, but nowhere near as bad as they. I still had my appetite and I took my booster shots, but I could feel the side effects. My hands kept shaking. I had a nasty headache. There were these pinches down my neck like someone was shocking me with a wet battery. I'd imagine things moving just outside of my vision. I kept turning around to look at the windows as I'd started to hallucinate that they were screens. By morning, there was a new problem, but both the power and the water had been cut off. There was a small lake a short walk from the house, and we had no choice but to try and get some water by hand. We had some drinking water stocked in the kitchen, but we needed some for the bathroom. My mother volunteered to go, but that was out of the question. She could barely stand or make coherent sentences. There was no discussion. Dad had to do it. We watched him from one of the upstairs windows. The sun had just risen, bathing the withering landscape in long, sharp shadows and sickly bright glow. My mom was just staring blankly ahead, as if trying to remember what was so important. Isn't it your birthday soon? She said out loud. Mom, that was Tuesday, remember? Did you wish for you to get older? She asked. I wish for that. I want you to be able to get older. She looked at me and laughed manically. She blinked one eye at a time, her left eye lingering a little longer than her right. Her eyes were sunken and dark, and she kept going cross-eyed. I think she meant well, but that look she gave me was nothing short of terrifying. The look was like she had been reduced to her most basic, primal self. My mother was still in there somewhere, but most of her was just gone. After about an hour, I spotted my dad coming back. Mom and I were both relieved, but it didn't last long. I noticed he wasn't out carrying any water. Moments later, I could see he was not alone. There were about 24 more people coming with him. Mom didn't seem to react. She just looked out the window and nodded to herself. For a moment, she was almost falling asleep, standing up, her mouth moving up and down on its own like a bass out of water. I could see something moving in her throat. I shook her, and in a moment of clarity, she looked out the window again as I heard something pound against the door downstairs. Mom pushed me into the closet. She ran downstairs to get the remaining booster shots and dropped it all on me along with her wristwatch and a couple of fiber bars. Someone will come get you, she said. Just wait, and please stay awake. I'll try to think of something. I did not have the time to protest before she slammed the door of the closet shut. I could hear a key slide into the lock downstairs. Dad may have forgotten something about who he was, but he had not forgotten how to use the house keys. I just sat there in the dark listening. I curled into a ball, but I did not want to get too comfortable. I could hear furniture being turned over, unfamiliar voices yelling obscenities or incoherent nonsense. A fight broke out and I could hear someone throwing something. Another person ran up the stairs into the bathroom, repeatedly kicking the bathtub. A woman screamed, then a man. There was a gunshot followed by windows being broken. I could hear a muffled scream as if someone was held down, maybe like they did with the man outside the night before. I must have sat there for hours in the dark. It was hard to tell if my eyes were open or not. I couldn't tell if I was really hearing something outside or if I was just imagining it. I could hear voices and whispers, but they didn't seem to make sense. Sometimes I imagined them standing just outside my door, asking me for the cheat codes for the games I'd played. All I had to keep my waning sanity company was my mom's wristwatch, and I could barely make it out. Time passed strangely. I could be wrapped in a thought for what felt like hours, but only minutes passed. Then I'd catch myself staring straight ahead, and 2 hours could disappear. I kept repeating the next scheduled hour for the booster shot like a mantra. But things kept getting stranger. The clock would go backwards. I'd imagine someone sitting across from me, a pair of white eyes staring back at me in the dark. There were little voices telling me go to sleep, and I found myself nodding off. I could feel something moving in me, like a hand trying to fit into a glove. I finally gave up and got out of the closet. I could barely stand as I dragged the booster shots and fiber bars along in a plastic bag. I didn't care if there was anyone downstairs. I needed to see something. I needed light or some kind of stimuli. My entire house was trashed, every piece of furniture broken, every light smashed, blood splattered on the walls, and the front door was hanging on a single hinge. Every window smashed, and our picture frames had been thrown across the room like ninja stars. But by far the strangest thing was an acrid smell coming from the kitchen. At first I didn't understand what it was. It looked like a person, but there was the wrong number of limbs. After a few seconds of adjustment and trying to force myself to clear it, I realized it was a dead body. A young man with a knife sticking out of his chest splayed out on the kitchen floor. His jaws extended and broken on one side. There was a black and blue arm reaching out of his throat, reaching upwards to grab his own head. Something in me stirred. Something in me didn't like what I was looking at, and I was not sure if it was me or something else. I tried to push it down with the fiber bar, which strangely worked. I made my way outside in a daze. I did not know what to do. Part of me wanted to find my parents. Another part of me wanted to get out of town. I wanted to look for a bike or just start walking or catch a bus. Of course, there were no buses to catch. My sleep-deprived mind could not separate fact from fiction anymore. That entire night was one long living nightmare. I kept imagining things coming out from the dark. I could hear voices telling me to turn around, to stop, to run, all at once, and none at all. I could barely keep my balance, and stopping even for a moment would send me straight to sleep. I had to keep going. I even took an extra booster shot, which just gave me this sharp joint pain and made me sweat. I could tell I'd done something stupid. I took a shortcut through the park. I could see faces coming out of the trees. I saw a man lying face down on the gravel path being pulled forward by an arm coming out of his mouth. I saw a man out by the lake repeatedly slapping his arms against the cold water surface like a manic child trying to get his eye a splash as he could. Some of it was real, some of it wasn't. I couldn't tell which was which. When I finally reached downtown, I saw at least 24 people gathered outside a burning building. All of them with black and blue arms reaching out of their mouths, stretching towards the flames, as if slowly wafting air towards them, like human help moving against an invisible current. They leaned back and forth in unison, praising whatever chaos they'd caused without a word or sound, and yet I could hear them, welcoming me, beckoning me, all voices unique, carried to me by an unfelt wind. Come closer, it begged. You belong here. I turned away and the voices grew louder, desperate, screeching, demanding my attention, my devotion, some of them coming from outside, some of them coming from the rumble of my stomach. It's always here, it laughed. It'll never go away. It'll never sleep. It'll never stop. Hands reached for me. A face in every window, voices reaching from beneath the concrete. Gunfire, broken windows, glass cracking under my rubber boots as I shuffled past burnt-out cars. It was dark, then bright, then dark again. At some point I succumbed. I felt the concrete against my cheek, but I could not bring myself to get up. My legs just would not move. My eyes would not open. Yes, the voices laughed. Come to us. Come burn with us. And then darkness. I don't know how long I was out. Hours. Maybe half a day. I woke up to see a man running towards me, asking if I was okay. A car had pulled over, bathing me in a warm light, but the side of the road, a colony of frogs looked at me. In the distance, my eyes landed on a discolored sunflower. It turned blue. Strange how you don't notice the most obvious changes until they stare at you in the face. Turns out exposure had happened at least 6 hours earlier than the man with the clipboard had predicted, and I had been awake long enough for most of the effect to pass through my system. I was found unconscious by the side of the highway about 9 miles from my house. While I did have an uncomfortable, dreamless sleep, the effects it had on me were nowhere near as bad as what happened to most of the neighbors. I'm sure you've heard of it. Riots, they called it. Just another mess up in a low-income area. I don't even think it reached national news. Some of the people who succumbed to it early got permanent brain damage. Larry Peterson was never the same, but it was hard to tell if it was because of the emotional trauma or the sleep thing. Either way, he had to have a nurse come look after him a few times a week for the rest of his life. Mom and Dad were not completely unharmed either. Mom developed some kind of narcolepsy after that night, spontaneously nodding off at the most inappropriate times. My father had lost his sense of taste and smell. To this day, they're having a hard time explaining what exactly they experienced. To them, it was just like going to sleep and having the most horrible nightmare, only to wake up in a hospital bed. Sometimes I wonder if I did fall asleep. Some of the things I saw were so strange that there was no way to tell if they were real or not. I vividly remember that scene of the hands waving back and forth outside that burning building downtown. It had to be real. The building really did burn. As you might imagine, I have a hard time looking back at this. Thinking too much about it gives me this icy feeling pit my stomach. Like a small part of me believes that this is all just a big nightmare, that I am still just a clock stick away from waking up in that closet with someone standing just outside outside waiting for me. Or maybe it's something inside of me still wanting to grab the reins. Maybe it's just a night away. I hope you all have enjoyed this No Sleep and Creepypasta ASMR style whispering. Good night.